The last briefing before the drop was held in the Archon's war chamber, and Commander Kithra could feel the fear in the room the way she could feel pressure changes in deep water, not through any single sense but through all of them at once, a tightening that pressed against the inside of her chest and made the air taste like iron. 32 officers stood around the tactical pit. All of them wore the black ceremonial armor of the Vorathi Reclamation Corps, plating that had not been donned in living memory. Most of them were too young to know what the armor meant. Kithra was not. She had been hatched in the last cycle before the long silence, when the Elder Archon still told stories of the seeding missions, the days when the Vorathi had walked among the primitive worlds, planting their monitoring stations in ocean trenches and mountain cores, cataloging species too young to look up at the stars and wonder who was watching. Earth had been one of those worlds. Sol 3 in the old charts, a high-gravity rock with a corrosive oxygen atmosphere and a dominant species barely past stone tools. The Vorathi had classified them as emergent for bright enough to tag, too fragile to matter. The monitoring stations had been planted 80,000 years ago by a survey fleet that had spent less than a local season on the surface before filing its report and moving on. The report had said, no threat, no strategic value, recommend observation only, return in 50,000 years. No one had returned. The relay corridors had collapsed one by one during the contraction, the long millennia when the Vorathi Empire had folded inward like a dying star, losing colony after colony to the entropy of distance and the slow rot of infrastructure no one remembered how to maintain. The seeding missions had been forgotten. The monitoring stations had been written off. Sol 3 had become a line in an archive that no one read. Until 3 cycles ago, when a deep-range listening post on the Empire's trailing edge had picked up something that should not have existed, a transmission from the Sol system, structured and dense, broadcasting on frequencies the Vorathi had invented, and then abandoned 40,000 years before anyone in the current generation had been born. The transmission was not a distress signal. It was not a greeting. It was a navigational beacon, broadcasting updated corridor maps for a transit network that the Vorathi had believed was extinct. Someone in the Sol system was using Vorathi technology, or something that had evolved from it. The probability models are clear, said strategist Orath, his voice carrying the flat calm of someone who had rehearsed his words until the fear had been polished out of them. He gestured at the tactical pit, where a holographic rendering of the Sol system rotated slowly. The rendering was based on 80,000-year-old survey data overlaid with the fragmentary sensor readings from the listening post. The overlay was almost useless. The old data showed a quiet yellow star with 8 unremarkable planets. The new readings showed electromagnetic saturation across every detectable frequency, gravitational anomalies consistent with massive artificial structures, and energy signatures that the listening post's processors had flagged as unclassifiable before shutting down from data overload. Sol 3 is no longer an emergent 4 world, Orath continued. The electromagnetic profile alone suggests a civilization operating at a minimum of Tier 2, possibly Tier 1. The room went still. Tier 2 was the Vorathi's own classification, the ceiling they had reached at the height of the old empire, before the contraction stripped it away. Tier 1 had no living example in any database the empire maintained. It existed only as a theoretical category, a mathematical projection of what a civilization could become if it avoided collapse long enough. Kithra watched her officers' faces. Some of them were trying to maintain composure. Others had given up. The youngest, a sensor officer named Velen, whose crest had not yet hardened, was gripping the edge of the tactical pit with both hands, his claws leaving shallow gouges in the alloy. Our mandate is reconnaissance, Kithra said. She kept her voice level the way her combat instructor had taught her decades ago. The commander's voice is the crew's spine. We are not an invasion force. We are not a war fleet. We are 32 officers and 400 crew aboard a single dreadnought-class vessel that has not fired its main battery in 11 centuries. We are going to Sol 3 to determine the status of the monitoring stations and the current state of the dominant species. We will observe. We will record. We will not engage. She looked around the room. Questions. Oreth raised one hand. Commander, if the dominant species has reached Tier 2, our single vessel will be outmatched in every measurable category. Observation may not be our choice to make. Then we will make it our choice by being careful. And if they detect us before we are ready? Kithra held his gaze. Then we will learn something about them very quickly. She dismissed the briefing. The officers filed out in silence, their boots clicking on the deck plates in a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. Kithra remained at the tactical pit. She placed both hands on the rim and stared at the holographic Sol system, watching the tiny blue dot of the third planet rotate in its ancient orbit. 80,000 years. The Vorathi had been masters of 100 systems when they last stood on that world's surface. Now they held 9, and 3 of those were in managed decline. The contraction had taken everything: the relay network, the colony infrastructure, the industrial base, the confidence. What remained was an empire that remembered being vast and could not stop mourning the loss. And somewhere on that blue dot, or above it, or around it, something had grown in the silence. She wondered if it remembered the Vorathi. She wondered if it cared. The transit took 11 days through the last functional corridor, and every day the readings got worse. By day 3, the passive sensors were picking up structured transmissions from Sol at distances that should have been impossible. The signals were not leaking, they were being broadcast deliberately, in layered formats that the Ironfang's communication array could partially decode. Navigation data, weather reports for planetary surfaces the Vorathi had never charted, traffic coordination for vessel movements numbering in the tens of thousands. All of it in languages the ship's translation matrix could not parse, running on carrier frequencies that used Vorathi base code architecture modified beyond recognition. The way a child's drawing of a house might share the same basic geometry as a cathedral, but be unrecognizable as the same concept. Kithra ordered the communications team to focus on the carrier frequencies. If the base code was genuinely Vorathi in origin, there might be fragments they could decode. The team worked through a full sleep cycle and came back with 3 findings that made the bridge go quiet. First, the carrier frequencies were using Vorathi encryption protocols, but versions of those protocols that had been iterated forward through at least 12,000 generations of refinement. The Vorathi Admiralty's current encryption was Generation 47. Second, embedded in the carrier layer beneath the primary transmissions was a secondary signal, a tag, a marker that repeated at regular intervals, broadcasting a single phrase in a language the translation matrix could almost parse. The closest rendering was, "Corridor open, origin traffic welcome." Third, the secondary signal was aimed, not broadcast omnidirectionally the way a standard navigational beacon would, aimed at the corridor the Ironfang was currently traveling through, at the Vorathi homeworld's last known transit route. They had been expected. By day 5, the translation matrix achieved its first partial decode of the primary transmissions. The result was mundane, which made it terrifying. It was a shipping manifest. Cargo quantities, departure timestamps, arrival windows, vessel registration codes, the administrative paperwork of commerce, broadcast openly on frequencies that anyone within 4 light-years could intercept. The manifest listed 914 vessel movements in a single rotational period of Sol 3. 914 ships, arriving and departing from the third planet alone, in one day. The Vorathi Empire's entire merchant fleet consisted of 230 vessels. Kithra ordered the manifest printed and posted on the bridge's secondary display. She wanted her officers to see it. Not the warship counts, not the gravitational anomalies, a shipping manifest. The banality of overwhelming power. This civilization did not need to threaten. Its grocery list was a threat. By day 6, the gravitational sensors registered anomalies. Something in the Sol system was generating gravity wells that had no natural explanation. Not planets, the mass signatures were wrong, too uniform, too precisely positioned. Artificial gravity generators on a scale the Vorathi had theorized but never built. The largest anomaly was centered on the 4th orbital position, where the old surveys had recorded a small, cold, dead world the primitives had named after one of their war gods. By day 7, the communications team reported a development that Kithra initially refused to believe. They had isolated the secondary signal, the one tagged corridor open, origin traffic welcome, and traced its broadcast history through the corridor's own relay echoes. The signal had been broadcasting continuously for 14,000 years, not intermittently, not periodically, continuously. For 14 millennia, the humans had been sending an invitation into the Vorathi relay corridor, updating it as their language and technology evolved, maintaining the beacon the way a lighthouse keeper maintains a flame, waiting for someone to follow it home. 14,000 years of patience. The Vorathi High Council could not agree on a budget for longer than 3 cycles. Oreth came to her quarters that evening. He stood in her doorway with his crest half raised and his hands clasped behind his back, the posture of an officer who had something to say that his rank did not entitle him to say. "Permission to speak candidly, Commander." "Granted. We should leave, now, before we go any deeper." Kithra looked at him. "On what basis?" "On the basis that everything we have recorded in the last 6 days tells us the same thing. Whatever is in that system is so far beyond us that our presence here is irrelevant. We are not conducting reconnaissance. We are being allowed to approach. There is a difference." "I know the difference." "Then you know that the moment we are no longer allowed, we will not be able to leave." She considered this. He was not wrong. The stealth coating on the Iron Fang's hull was 11 centuries old. The humans had been broadcasting on Vorathi frequencies for 14,000 years, which meant they had possessed Voratha-level technology for at least that long, and had spent the intervening millennia improving it. The idea that the Iron Fang was invisible to their sensors was a comfort only if you did not think about it carefully. "We continue," she said. "Our mandate is reconnaissance, and we have not yet seen the planet. Everything else is preliminary data. I will not return to the Admiralty with a report that says we got frightened and turned around." Oreth held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded and left. She heard his boots receding down the corridor, each step carrying the weight of a man walking toward something he knew he could not walk away from. By day 8, Velen ran a comparative analysis between the gravitational anomalies and the known mass of the Vorathi homeworld. The results were simple. Object 7, the largest anomaly, positioned between the 3rd and 4th planets, had a mass energy output equivalent to 16 Vorathi homeworlds. Not the planet, the entire homeworld system. Every power station, every reactor, every energy facility across all 9 remaining Vorathi worlds combined, multiplied by 16. It was one object, in one system, and it was not the largest thing there. By day 9, Kithra ordered the crew to general quarters. Not because of any hostile action, there had been none, but because the sensor feed had become so dense with data that the bridge crew was struggling to process it, and the ambient tension aboard the Iron Fang had reached a pitch where she could hear it in every voice, see it in every posture, taste it in the recycled air. "Commander," Velen's voice cracked on the 2nd syllable. He was standing at his station, his crest fully raised, the involuntary threat display of a Vorathi who was frightened beyond the ability to suppress instinct. "I have a preliminary visual composite of Sol 3. Put it on the main display. Velen's hands moved across the console. The tactical pit dimmed, and the main viewport display shifted from the star field ahead to a rendered image assembled from long-range optical data. Kithra felt her secondary heart begin to beat. The planet was there. The right size, the right orbital distance, the blue-white coloring of an oxygen world with liquid water. But it was surrounded by a shell of structures so dense that the planet itself was visible only through gaps in the lattice, like looking at a gemstone through a cage of silver wire. Orbital platforms at multiple altitudes, linked by transit corridors that pulsed with light. Shipyards large enough to be visible from the outer system, their frameworks holding vessels in various stages of construction. Defense installations studding the orbital shell at regular intervals, each one bristling with emitter arrays that the sensor computers flagged as weapons but could not classify. And beyond the orbital shell, in the deeper lanes of the system, warships. Kithra counted them the way she had been trained to count enemy assets quickly, by class, noting tonnage and armament profiles. She stopped counting at 200. The ships ranged from patrol corvettes smaller than the Iron Fang's shuttle bay to capital vessels that dwarfed her dreadnought the way a mountain dwarfs a stone. The largest ones were visible as silhouettes against the sun, dark shapes 10 kilometers long, their hulls dense with weapons platforms, moving in formation patterns that spoke of absolute coordination and absolute confidence. No one on the bridge spoke. Oreth was the first to break the silence. Those are not Tier 2 vessels. No, Kithra said. Commander, those are not Tier 1 vessels either. There is no classification for what those are. Kithra did not respond. She was staring at the rendered image, trying to reconcile what she was seeing with the survey report from 80,000 years ago. Stone tools, agricultural settlements, a species that burned wood for heat and carved symbols on rocks. The Vorathi surveyor who had filed the original classification had stood on a hilltop above one of their settlements, watched them carry water in clay vessels and written, "No threat, no strategic value." She understood in that moment something that she suspected no Vorathi had understood in a very long time. The survey had been correct 80,000 years ago. The mistake was not in the observation. The mistake was in the assumption that what was true then would remain true forever. "Take us in," she said quietly. "Minimum emission profile, passive sensors only. We observe until I say otherwise." The Iron Fang crept into the Sol system like a shadow sliding across a wall. Kithra had ordered every non-essential system powered down, every emission source shuttered, every active sensor array locked in receive-only mode. The Dreadnought's hull was designed for stealth operations, its outer plating coated in signal-absorbent material that had been state-of-the-art when it was applied 11 centuries ago. They passed the outer planets first. The gas giants were largely unchanged, vast, indifferent, their atmospheres churning in the same patterns the old surveys had recorded. But their moons had been modified. Mining infrastructure was visible on 3 of the 6th planet's satellites, automated extraction facilities drawing materials from the moon rock and feeding them into orbital fabrication arrays that hung above each moon like metallic clouds. The rings of the 6th planet itself had been threaded with structures, long, narrow platforms that Velen identified as energy collection arrays, harvesting the kinetic energy of the ring particles as they orbited. "They are using the planet's rings as a power source," Velen said. His voice carried a mixture of professional admiration and personal dread. "The engineering required to harvest orbital kinetic energy without destabilizing the ring structure is Commander. We do not have the mathematics for this. This is not something we know how to calculate." "Note it," Kithra said. "Continue." The 5th planet, the gas giant, had been left untouched, its massive bulk spinning in solitary grandeur. But its moons told a different story. The 4 largest had been connected by a visible transit web, luminous threads of energy linking them in a tetrahedral pattern. Each moon showed signs of habitation, atmospheric domes on two, full atmospheric envelopes on the other two, surface cities visible as geometric patterns of light against the dark rock. Population estimates were impossible at this range, but the electromagnetic signatures suggested billions. The fourth planet stopped her cold. The old surveys had recorded it as a dead world, thin atmosphere, no liquid water, geological activity minimal. What the sensors showed now was a living planet. The atmosphere had been thickened to the point where it registered as breathable on the Iron Fang's environmental scanners. Liquid water was present on the surface in quantities consistent with engineered oceans, and covering the northern hemisphere, visible from orbit, was a forest. Not the scrubby, struggling vegetation of a terraforming project in its early stages. A mature forest, an ecosystem that had been growing for millennia, its canopy so dense that the surface beneath was invisible to optical sensors. Cities were visible at the forest edges, built into the landscape rather than on top of it, their structures rising from the tree line like extensions of the natural world. Kithra stared at the display for a long time. The Vorathi had spent 3 centuries trying to terraform their colony world of Sethar. The project had failed. The atmosphere had refused to stabilize, the engineered biosphere had collapsed twice, and the colony had eventually been abandoned. Its ruins were still visible from orbit, a monument to ambition that had outstripped capability. These people had turned a dead planet into a garden, and they had done it so long ago that the garden had become a wilderness. "There is a population estimate for the fourth planet," Velen said. 14 billion, plus or minus 2 billion. The margin of error is due to the density of the surface infrastructure masking individual biosignatures. 14 billion on a world they had made habitable from raw rock. The Vorathi's total population across 9 systems was 8 billion. Between the third and fourth planets in the orbital zone that should have held nothing but vacuum, the Iron Fang sensors detected Object 7. Not a station, not a ship. A structure, an artificial body 300 kilometers across, rotating slowly on its axis, its surface covered in docking infrastructure, habitat modules, manufacturing facilities, and weapons platforms. It hung in the void like a small moon that someone had built on purpose, its mass generating its own gravity well, its surface crawling with the signatures of vessels arriving and departing in a continuous stream. "What is that?" Orath asked, and for the first time his rehearsed calm had broken entirely. "A transit hub," Velen said. "The vessel traffic is consistent with a major logistics node. Commander, the energy output of Object 7 alone exceeds the combined output of every power generation facility in the Vorathi Empire." "By how much?" Velen checked his readings twice. "By a factor of approximately 31. Kithra absorbed this. She filed it alongside the 14 billion on the fourth planet, the weapons platforms in the sixth planet's rings, the warships larger than mountains. Filed it the way she had been trained to file overwhelming data. Calmly, one fact at a time, building the picture without letting the picture build her. "Continue approach," she said. "Take us to observation distance from Sol 3. They were 2 light minutes from Earth when they were found. It happened without warning. One moment the passive sensors showed clear space ahead, the orbital shell of Sol 3 visible as a glittering band against the dark. The next moment, a vessel was alongside them. Not approaching, not decelerating from a higher velocity, simply there, as if it had been waiting in a fold of space that the Iron Fang sensors could not detect, and had unfolded itself into reality when it chose to be seen. The vessel was a warship. Kithra recognized the design language immediately: weapons platforms, armored hull, engine configuration optimized for combat maneuverability. It was roughly twice the size of the Iron Fang, painted in a deep gunmetal gray with markings along the hull in a script she could not read. Its weapons were not powered. Its shields were not raised. It sat alongside the Iron Fang with the patient confidence of a predator that does not need to hurry. "Incoming transmission," the communications officer said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. "It is addressed to us by name, by our full registry designation." Kithra's blood ran cold. The Iron Fang's full registry designation was a Vorathi naval classification that had been assigned 800 years ago and existed in exactly one database, maintained by the Vorathi Admiralty on the homeworld of Seti. That database was encrypted. That database was classified. That database was stored in a facility that had not been connected to any external network since its construction. "Put it through." The voice that filled the bridge was calm, measured, and spoke in flawless High Vorathi, the formal diplomatic dialect that had not been used in common speech for 6,000 years. "Commander Kithra of the Vorathi Reclamation Corps, Dreadnought Iron Fang, you are welcome in the Sol system. We have been expecting vessels of Vorathi origin for some time. Please do not adjust your emission profile or power your weapon systems. An escort will guide you to a position where you may observe comfortably. All of your crew are safe. No hostile action will be taken against your vessel." The bridge was silent. Kithra could hear the blood pulsing in her own ears. "How do they know High Vorathi?" Oreth whispered. Kithra had a theory, and it was not comforting. The monitoring stations the Vorathi had seeded on Earth 80,000 years ago had contained full linguistic databases, every Vorathi language, dialect, and code system, stored in crystalline matrices designed to last 100,000 years. If the dominant species had found those stations, cracked them open, and decoded the contents, they would have learned every language the Vorathi had ever spoken, including the classified military dialects, including the encryption protocols, including the naval registry formats. They had been studying the Vorathi for longer than the Vorathi had been studying them. She keyed the transmission. "This is Commander Kithra. We acknowledge your message. We are here to observe only. We carry no hostile intent." A pause. Then the voice again, and this time there was something in its tone that Kithra could not immediately identify: warmth, perhaps, or something adjacent to it. Patience. The patience of someone who has waited a very long time and is not in a hurry now that the waiting is over. "We know, Commander. We have monitored your approach since you entered the corridor. Your stealth systems are impressive for their era. We chose to allow you to approach unimpeded so that you could observe the system on your own terms before we made contact. We thought you would appreciate seeing it without narration first." They had known. The entire approach, the 11 days of creeping through the system, the passive sensor observations, the careful minimum emission profile that Kithra had believed was hiding them, they had been watching the whole time. Every reading the Iron Fang had taken, every whispered conversation on the bridge, every moment Kithra had spent staring at the display trying to understand what she was seeing, they had seen her seeing it. And they had let her look. "Your monitoring stations," Kithra said, "you found them." "Yes, 27,000 years ago by your time reckoning. They were located in our ocean trenches and mountain cores, exactly where your survey teams placed them. We spent 3 centuries decoding their contents. Your survey reports were illuminating." There was no anger in the voice, no accusation, no contempt, just a statement of fact delivered with the same measured calm. Kithra thought about the original survey report, the one that had classified this species as emergent 4, noted their clay vessels and carved stones, and recommended observation only. That report had been decoded and read by the very species it had dismissed. "I imagine they were," Kithra said quietly. The escort vessel guided the Iron Fang to a holding position above Earth's northern hemisphere, at an altitude that placed them above the orbital shell, but below the outermost defense installations. It was, Kithra realized, a position chosen with deliberate care high enough to see the planet and its infrastructure spread out below like a map, low enough to appreciate the scale of individual structures. A viewing platform. They were being given the best seat in the house. Earth was beneath them. The planet that the Vorathi had seeded and left behind, the world of clay vessels and carved stones, the emergent fore rock that no one had bothered to revisit. The orbital shell was even more staggering from close range. The platforms were not uniform, they varied in size, design, and apparent function, layered at different altitudes like the strata of a geological formation. Some were clearly military weapons platforms with emitter arrays that the Iron Fang's computers could not model, sensor installations whose resolution must have been capable of reading individual molecules at interplanetary distances. Others were civilian habitat rings spinning slowly to generate gravity, their transparent sections showing green spaces, water features, structures that looked like neighborhoods where people lived and raised children above the world their ancestors had been born on. Threading through all of it, the ships, thousands of them, moving in patterns so complex they looked like the circulatory system of a living organism. Freighters, patrol craft, construction tenders, passenger vessels, and warships, always the warships, cruising through the orbital traffic with an unhurried authority that made every other vessel adjust its path. "Commander," Velen's voice was barely above a whisper, "I have completed a preliminary census of the military assets visible from our current position. Within direct visual and sensor range, approximately 1/8 of the planet's orbital space, I count 247 warships of various classes. 11 of those are capital-class vessels exceeding 5 kilometers in length. The largest is approximately 12 kilometers bow to stern." He swallowed audibly. If this density is consistent around the full orbital circumference, the total military presence around Sol 3 alone is approximately 2,000 warships. 2,000 warships around one planet. The Vorathi Navy, across 9 systems, fielded 43 combat-capable vessels. 30 of those were patrol boats. "What about the 4th planet?" Kithra asked. "Similar density, possibly higher. The 4th planet appears to have its own independent defense fleet." He hesitated. "Commander, I am also detecting what appear to be dormant weapons platforms in the asteroid belt. They are cold, no active emissions, but the mass signatures are consistent with very large emitter arrays. I count over 600 before the resolution fails." "If they were activated simultaneously." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. The escort vessel made no effort to restrict their scanning. In the hours that followed, Kithra authorized a full passive sensor survey from their holding position, and the data that accumulated was like watching a portrait painted in escalating shades of impossibility. The orbital platforms nearest to them were not merely functional structures. They were old. Their surfaces showed the layered patina of construction that had been maintained and expanded across centuries, original framework beneath newer additions, older architectural styles visible where panels had been replaced with updated materials. Some of the platforms had been in continuous operation for over 10,000 years. Their infrastructure was older than the Vorathi Empire's current capital building. Velen identified a shipyard complex on the far side of the planet, visible only through a gap in the orbital shell. The complex held 16 construction cradles, each one occupied. 8 of the vessels under construction were capital class. The other 8 were something larger, a class the Iron Fang's database had no designation for, their unfinished hulls already exceeding 15 kilometers in length, their structural frameworks suggesting weapons systems built into the very bones of the ship rather than mounted on the exterior. "They are building the next generation," Orath said quietly. He had been standing at the viewport for the last hour, his arms crossed, his tail perfectly still, the posture of a strategist who had finished calculating and arrived at an answer he did not want to share. "What is your assessment?" Kithra asked. My assessment is that everything we are looking at, the 2,000 warships, the orbital platforms, the defense installations, the dormant arrays in the asteroid belt, is the current deployment, the standing force, what they maintain as a matter of routine. He turned to face her. Those ships in the construction cradles are not replacements, Commander. They are additions. They are still building. They have been building for millennia and they have not stopped, and as far as I can determine, they have no reason to stop. There is no enemy threatening them, no rival constraining their growth. They build because they decided to build, and they have never undecided. Why? Orath looked back at the viewport, at the warships gliding through the orbital shell in their patient, unhurried formations. Because they remember being small, and they remember what the galaxy does to things that are small. The second escort vessel appeared 2 hours later, identical to the first, materializing from empty space without any detectable approach vector. It took station on the Iron Fang's opposite flank, and Kithra understood the geometry immediately. They were bracketed, not threatened. Bracketed the way a host places a guest between 2 chairs to make them comfortable. The weapons on both vessels remained unpowered. Their shields remained lowered. But their presence said, clearly and without malice, we know exactly where you are, and we want you to know that we know. A transmission came 6 hours into their observation period. It was a request, not a demand, not an order. A request, phrased in high Vorathi with the formal courtesies the language required. Commander Kithra, we would be honored if you would accept a guided observation of the surface. A shuttle will be provided. You may bring any officers you wish. The purpose is to show you what grew from the world your ancestors seeded and left. No obligation, no conditions, no recording restrictions. Kithra looked at Orath. He looked back at her with an expression she had never seen on his face, not fear, not anger, but something that resembled the look of a person standing at the edge of a cliff, and realizing the ground they thought was solid had been eroding beneath them for a very long time. We should go, she said. Commander, we came here to observe. They are offering us the chance to observe from the best possible vantage. We would be fools to refuse. Orath hesitated, and if it is a trap? Kithra gestured at the viewport, at the 2,000 warships visible in the orbital shell, at the weapons platforms that could reduce the Iron Fang to vapor before her crew could reach the firing console, at the dormant arrays in the asteroid belt that could sterilize the space between planets. If they wanted us dead, Orath, we would already be dead. They do not need a trap. They do not need anything from us at all, and that is what frightens you. He started to speak, then stopped. His jaw worked silently. Then he straightened his shoulders in the way that Vorathi officers did when they accepted an order they disagreed with, and said, I will prepare a security detail. 2 officers, sidearms only. We are guests, not an occupying force. Yes, Commander. He turned to leave. At the doorway of the observation chamber, he paused without turning around. Commander, if they already know everything about us, our languages, our encryption, our naval registry, then they know the current state of the Empire. They know about the contraction. They know how many systems we have lost, how many ships we can field, how far our capabilities have declined. Yes. They know we are weak. Yes. And they invited us anyway. He left the observation chamber. Kithra stood alone at the viewport, looking down at the planet that had turned every assumption her civilization had ever held into a punchline, and wondered what it meant that the most powerful species she had ever encountered had chosen to open its door to the weakest visitor imaginable and call it an honor. The shuttle that arrived was not a combat vessel. It was sleek, elegant, its hull material shifting color as it caught the light, some kind of adaptive surface coating that the Iron Fang sensors could not analyze. The interior was designed for comfort, with seating that adjusted to Vorathi body configuration the moment they sat down. The adjustment was instantaneous and precise, as if the shuttle's systems had studied Vorathi physiology in advance. Of course they had studied everything. Kithra brought Orath, Velen, and 2 security officers. The human pilot, the first human she had seen in person, was tall, dark-haired, wearing a simple gray uniform with a single insignia on the collar, a circle bisected by a vertical line. The pilot greeted them in high Vorathi, then guided the shuttle down through the orbital shell in a descent so smooth it felt like falling through warm water. They broke through the cloud layer above a coastline, and Kithra gripped the armrest of her seat hard enough to feel the alloy flex beneath her claws. The first thing she saw was the ocean. It stretched to the horizon, blue-green and vast, its surface marked by wave patterns that the Iron Fang's orbital sensors had not been able to resolve. Ships were visible on the water, surface vessels, not spacecraft, moving in lanes that spoke of organized maritime commerce. Some of them were enormous, their decks piled with cargo containers that caught the sunlight. The Vorathi had abandoned surface water transport 9,000 years ago. These people who could build warships that dwarfed moons still sailed their oceans, not because they had to, because they chose to. Because the ocean was part of who they were, and they had not forgotten it. Then the coastline came into view, and the city behind it, and Kithra stopped thinking about the ocean. A city stretched from horizon to horizon, not a city the way the Vorathi built cities: dense, vertical, utilitarian, built to house populations and process resources, and then be abandoned when the resources ran out. This was something else entirely. The buildings rose in organic spirals, their surfaces catching the afternoon sunlight and refracting it into colors that shifted as the angle changed, colors that Kithra's visual spectrum should not have been able to perceive but somehow could, as if the materials themselves were broadcasting light on frequencies calibrated to Vorathi optics. Parks and waterways threaded between the structures, vast green spaces that were not gaps in the city but integral elements of its design, as integrated as walls and roofs. Transit corridors of light connected the major structures, carrying streams of vehicles that moved in 3 dimensions with the fluid coordination of a school of fish changing direction in unison. And woven through all of it, visible only because Kithra had been trained to look for the things that wanted to remain unseen, defense systems. Emitter arrays built into the spiraling towers, concealed behind panels that could retract in seconds. Ground installations along the coastline, each housing weapons that could reach orbit. Sensor nets layered across the landscape like invisible threads in a web so fine that a dust particle could not enter the airspace undetected. The beauty was real. The beauty was also armor. This civilization had learned to make its defenses beautiful because it intended to keep them forever. The shuttle descended to a landing platform on a hilltop overlooking a bay. The platform was white composite, seamlessly integrated into the hillside. As Kithra stepped out, the air hit her like a wall, thick with oxygen, heavy with gravity, carrying scents she had no names for, flowering compounds, decomposing vegetation, salt from the bay below. The gravity pressed against her joints with a force half again what the Vorathi homeworld exerted. This world's pull was punishing. The species that had grown here, that had evolved under this crushing weight, breathing this corrosive atmosphere, surviving the predators and the weather, and the geological violence of a planet that seemed actively hostile to the survival of anything living on its surface, had done so for hundreds of thousands of years before the Vorathi ever arrived. They had been strong before the Vorathi found them. The Vorathi had simply been too confident to notice. A woman was waiting on the platform. She was tall, taller than Kithra by nearly a head, with silver-streaked hair and dark eyes that held the particular steadiness of someone who carried the weight of deep memory. She wore a dark tunic with the same circle and line insignia. "Commander Kithra," the woman said, in high Vorathi that carried the slight warmth of a language learned out of respect rather than necessity. "My name is Adiz Enwasu. I am the curator of origins for this region. Welcome to Earth." Kithra looked at the city spread out below, at the warships visible as distant shapes above the skyline, at the orbital shell glittering in the afternoon sky like a second firmament made of steel and light. "Your species," Kithra said. "In our survey 80,000 years ago you were classified as emergent for stone tools, agricultural settlements, a dominant species too primitive to pose any obstacle." "Yes," Adi said. "We found that report. We found all of them." "I have a question that I expect you have been asked before." Adiz waited. "Were you angry?" The curator smiled. It was not a triumphant smile. It was the smile of someone who remembered what it felt like to be small, and who understood the distance between smallness and the place where she now stood, and who did not take pleasure in the smallness of others. "We were for a time, and then we were busy, and then we were grateful. The anger passed, the gratitude did not." She led them along a path that wound down the hillside through engineered forest. The trees were enormous trunk diameters of 3 meters or more, canopy so dense that the sunlight filtered through in green and gold shafts that moved like living things as the wind stirred the upper branches. Kithra's security officers kept their hands near their sidearms. Kithra told them to stop. "There is nothing here that will harm you," Adiz said. "We designed this forest to be safe. We design most things to be safe now. We have had a long time to learn the difference between strength and danger." The path ended at a structure built into the hillside low, wide, its entrance framed by stone that had been shaped but not polished, left rough in a way that seemed deliberate. A monument to the unfinished. Inside, the space opened into a gallery that stretched deep into the hill, its walls lined with display cases, each one lit from within. The first case held a monitoring station, a Vorathi monitoring station, the same model that had been planted on this world 80,000 years ago. Its crystalline matrix was intact, still faintly luminous, its housing scratched and corroded by millennia of submersion in salt water. Beside it was a placard in multiple languages, including High Vorathi. VORATHI Potion Monitoring Station. Recovered from the Mariana complex, 53,200 years after placement. First artifact of extraterrestrial origin, confirmed by human science. This station contained the linguistic and technological database that initiated humanity's understanding of the wider galaxy. Kithra stared at it. This small device, this standard-issue monitoring unit that a Vorathi technician had planted in an ocean trench and forgotten about before the shuttle had cleared the atmosphere, had been the seed. The key that had unlocked everything above her. "We found 23 of them," Adiz said, standing beside her. "Across your original survey sites, ocean floors, mountain cores, polar ice sheets. It took us 3 centuries to decode the crystalline matrices. Another 2 centuries to understand the technology well enough to begin adapting it. The relay architecture was the breakthrough. Once we understood how your transit corridors functioned, we began building our own." The next case held fragments of the original Vorathi survey equipment, a soil sampler, an atmospheric analyzer, a biological scanning array. All of them corroded, all of them carefully preserved. The placards noted their recovery dates, their locations, and the breakthroughs they had enabled. "Every piece of technology your ancestors left behind taught us something," Adiz said. "The atmospheric analyzer led to our understanding of exotic gas engineering, which made the terraforming of Mars possible. The biological scanner's frequency modulation principles became the basis for our medical imaging systems. Your soil sampler's microreactor design was the ancestor of the fusion cores that power our orbital platforms." Kithra felt something shift in her chest. It was not the secondary heartbeat of combat stress. It was something older and less familiar, a tightening that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the realization that she was standing in a place where her people's casual, dismissive act of planting monitoring stations on a primitive world had been received not as an insult, but as a gift. They had not been angry. They had been students, and they had surpassed their unknowing teachers by a margin that made the words surpassed feel inadequate. "We built a civilization," Adiz said quietly, "on the foundation your ancestors left behind. We studied your technology until we understood it, then we improved it, then we surpassed it. But we never forgot where it came from. This gallery exists so that we remember." She paused. Her voice carried the weight of a sentence she had said many times to many visitors, but which had never lost its meaning. "And so that, when you finally came back, and we always believed you would come back, we could show you what your gift became." The tour continued. Adiz took them through the gallery's deeper chambers, where the displays shifted from Vorathi artifacts to human adaptations of Vorathi technology, then to purely human innovations that had no Vorathi antecedent. The progression was deliberate. Each chamber was a century. Each century was a leap. The third chamber showed the first human-built relay node, a crude thing by the standards of what orbited above them now, but recognizably derived from Vorathi transit architecture. It had been constructed 24,000 years ago. The placard noted that 37 human engineers had died during its testing phase, killed by energy discharges their shielding could not contain. Their names were listed on the wall, all 37. The fourth chamber showed the first interplanetary transit, a vessel called the Outermost that had crossed from Sol 3 to Sol 4 using a relay corridor built entirely with human technology. The transit had taken 9 seconds. The journey by conventional thrust would have taken 7 months. A holographic display showed the ship's departure and arrival in real time. 9 seconds. The room where this display lived was larger than the Iron Fang's entire forward section. The fifth chamber stopped Velen in his tracks. It contained a star chart not projected, but physically rendered in a transparent medium that filled the center of the room like a frozen ocean. Every star within 500 light-years of Sol was represented, and connecting many of them were luminous threads, relay corridors, human-built relay corridors, extending outward from the Sol system in a web that reached into regions of space the Vorathi had never charted. "How far does your relay network extend?" Kithra asked. "Currently, 1,140 light-years in its longest axis," Adiz said. "We add approximately 2 new corridors per century. We are not in a hurry." 1,100 light-years. The Vorathi relay network at its peak before the contraction had spanned 300. Its current operational range was 47. The seventh chamber held something that made Oreth sit down on the bench provided and put his head in his hands. It was a recording, a visual record of the terraforming of the fourth planet, compressed into a continuous loop that played on the chamber's walls. The recording spanned 6,000 years. It showed a dead red world slowly, incrementally, impossibly turning green, atmosphere thickening, ice caps melting into rivers, engineered organisms spreading across the surface in waves, cities rising at the edges of new forests. The process was not fast. It was not dramatic. It was patient. It was the work of a species that measured its projects in millennia and did not consider this unusual. 6,000 years, Oreth said, his voice muffled by his hands. They spent 6,000 years on a single planet. "We have many planets," Adiz said gently, "and many years." The ninth chamber showed their medical technology, the systems that had extended human lifespan to the point where natural death had become a philosophical choice rather than a biological certainty. The 10th showed their gravitational engineering. The 11th showed their energy systems, drawing power from the quantum structure of space itself. The 12th showed their material science, producing alloys the Iron Fang sensors could not classify. Each chamber was more advanced than the last. Each one represented a capability that the Vorathi had never achieved, had never theorized, had never imagined was possible. and each one was presented not as a boast, but as a fact, the way a mountain presents its height, without commentary, without comparison. It simply was what it was. And always, underneath it all, woven into the foundation of every advancement, the defense systems. The weapons platforms, the warship fleets, the sensor networks, the orbital shell that wrapped around their worlds like layered armor. Not because they were at war, not because they faced an immediate threat, because they remembered being small, because they remembered being observed by something larger and older and being judged insufficient. And because they had decided, somewhere in the long millennia between the first decoded monitoring station and the last warship launched from the fourth planet's orbital shipyards, that they would never be insufficient again. "You built all of this because of us," Kithra said. Adiz considered the words carefully. "We built all of this because of what you showed us was possible. Your technology was the spark, but the fire was ours." She looked at Kithra with those steady dark eyes. "And we defended it because of what your survey report showed us about how the galaxy sees the small. You wrote that we were no threat. You were right then. We made certain you would not be right again." They stood in the final chamber. It was the largest, its ceiling rising into darkness, its walls curved to form a dome whose interior surface was covered with a star map so detailed that Kithra could identify individual Vorathi colony systems among the millions of plotted points. At the center of the dome, suspended in a containment field that held it 3 meters above the floor, was a single object. It was a stone, a rough, uncut stone, gray-brown, the size of a human fist. Its surface was marked with carved symbols, angular, crude, clearly made by a tool no more sophisticated than another stone. The symbols were not Vorathi. They were human. The earliest known form of human symbolic communication. The carved markings on rock that the original Vorathi surveyor had noted in the classification report 80,000 years ago, and dismissed as evidence of rudimentary intelligence. The placard beneath it read, "Oldest known human inscription, approximately 82,000 years old, recovered from the Zagros Highland site. The markings translate approximately as, 'We were here.'" Kithra looked at it for a long time. The stone sat in its containment field at the center of a dome that mapped the stars, beneath a sky filled with warships, above a planet that had been transformed from a classified primitive world into the heart of something the Vorathi had no category for. A fist-sized rock with crude markings, given the place of highest honor in a civilization that could reshape planets. "We were here," she repeated. "Yes," Adiz said. "That is what they said 80,000 years ago when your ancestors were walking among them and deciding they were too primitive to matter. They carved it into a stone and left it in a cave where the rain could not reach it. They did not know who would read it. They did not know if anyone would, but they said it anyway, because it was true, and it is still true." The shuttle ride back to the Iron Fang was silent. Oreth sat with his hands clasped in his lap, staring at the floor of the shuttle as if the patterns in its surface held some answer he could not quite reach. Velen was reviewing the data he had recorded, scrolling through readings he would spend the rest of his career trying to understand. The 2 security officers sat with the particular stillness of soldiers who had just realized that everything they had been trained to defend against was irrelevant in the face of what they had seen. Kithra watched Earth shrink in the viewport as they ascended through the orbital shell. The planet's surface glowed in the late afternoon light, its cities visible as clusters of warm luminescence, its defense platforms catching the sun like scattered diamonds. Above it, the warships moved in their endless patrol, patient and unhurried, guarding a world that had not needed to fight anyone in centuries, but had never stopped preparing to. She thought about the survey report. No threat, no strategic value. She thought about the monitoring stations, planted and forgotten. She thought about the carved stone in the dome, "We were here," left in a cave by a species that the Vorathi had not considered worth naming. She thought about the gallery, the careful preservation of every Vorathi artifact, each one displayed with scholarly precision, the annotations that were methodical, not bitter, the gratitude that had outlasted the anger, the patience of a species that had taken what was left behind, studied it, learned from it, built upon it, and then waited for 27,000 years after decoding the monitoring stations, for 80,000 years after the Vorathi had first walked away, for the people who had dismissed them to come back and see. Not to punish, not to humiliate, not to demand an apology or extract a concession, to show. That was the part that unmade her, not the warships, not the orbital shell, not the terraformed planet or the transit hub or the weapons platforms in the asteroid belt. Those were power, and power could be understood. What could not be easily understood was the grace. The decision to preserve the artifacts of the civilization that had dismissed you, to learn its languages, to speak them with respect, to build a gallery honoring its contribution to your rise, and then to wait patiently, without bitterness, without urgency for that civilization to come back and be shown the truth. She keyed the ship-wide channel. Her voice carried to every compartment, every corridor, every crew member who had spent the last several days wondering whether they would survive this mission. This is the commander. We are returning to the Iron Fang. We will hold position for another 12 hours to complete our observations, and then we will depart the Sol system on the same corridor we used to enter. There will be no engagement. There will be no incident. The species on Sol 3, they call themselves humans, have extended courtesy and hospitality that we did not earn, and we will return it in kind. She paused. The words she wanted to say pressed against the inside of her throat like something too large to swallow. I will be filing a revised classification report upon our return to SETI. The original survey designation of Emergent 4 is rescinded. No replacement classification will be assigned because we do not possess a category adequate to describe what we have observed. She looked at the planet one last time, the blue-white sphere wrapped in its shell of steel and light. The reality is that we came here to classify them. They did not need to classify us. They already knew exactly what we were. She closed the channel. The bridge was quiet. Then from behind her, she heard Velen's voice, very small, very young, stripped of all professional detachment. Commander, the data package they sent us. I have been indexing it during the observation period. There is a section I think you should see. She turned. What section? It is filed under a heading that translates as Regarding the Vorathi. It contains a historical analysis of the Vorathi Empire written by human scholars, based on the decoded monitoring station data, and supplemented by long-range observation of Vorathi space over the last 14,000 years. A cold feeling settled in Kithra's chest. Long-range observation. Yes, Commander, they have been watching us. Not with the monitoring stations, those only contained data from 80,000 years ago. With telescopes, sensor arrays. Their relay network extends close enough to Vorathi space to detect our electromagnetic emissions. They have been watching our Empire contract for 14 millennia. She absorbed this. The humans had not merely decoded the monitoring stations and learned about the Vorathi of 80,000 years ago. They had continued watching. They had tracked the contraction in real time, the collapse of the relay corridors, the abandonment of colony worlds, the slow decline of a civilization that had once seeded monitoring stations on 100 primitive planets and now struggled to maintain 9. What does the analysis say? Velen was quiet for a moment. It says they considered intervening. 3 times. 3 separate proposals were drafted by their strategic council, spanning 7,000 years, each one recommending that humanity make contact with the Vorathi and offer technological assistance to halt the contraction. Why did they not? Because each time they concluded that uninvited intervention would be an act of the same arrogance that had led the Vorathi to seed monitoring stations on their world without asking permission. They decided to wait until the Vorathi came to them. On Vorathi terms. In Vorathi time. Kithra closed her eyes. 7,000 years of debate. 3 proposals drafted, considered, and set aside not out of indifference, not out of hostility, but out of a principle so deeply held that they had watched a civilization decline rather than violate it. They had waited for the Vorathi to come, and the Vorathi had come, and the humans had opened their door and said, "Welcome, we have been expecting you." The Ironfang departed the Sol system 2 days later, escorted to the outer corridor by the same gunmetal gray warship that had found them on approach. As they prepared to leave, a final transmission arrived from the surface. It was brief. It was addressed to Kithra personally, in High Vorathi, and it carried the signature of the Curator of Origins. "Commander, when your Admiralty reviews the data we have provided, and when the questions begin, and they will begin, please tell them that our relay corridors are open. The invitation is not conditional. It does not expire. We will be here." Kithra did not reply immediately. She read the message twice, then a third time. Then she keyed a response on the same frequency. "Curator Nwasu, I will convey your message. On behalf of the Vorathi Reclamation Corps, I extend my gratitude for your hospitality and your patience. Both were greater than we deserved." A pause, then Adi's voice, warm and steady across the void. "Commander, no one decides what another deserves. We only decide what we offer. Safe travels." As the transit corridor opened ahead and the stars began to stretch, Kithra stood at the viewport and watched Sol shrink to a point of yellow light among millions. She carried 2 things with her. The first was the data package the humans had transmitted, the complete history, the decoded records, the 27,000 years of annotations. It would reshape the Vorathi's understanding of themselves, of their empire's decline, and of the cost of assuming that what you leave behind stays left behind. The second was a memory, the carved stone in the dome, the crude symbols cut into rock by a hand that had never held a tool more sophisticated than another stone. The message that had outlasted empires, outlasted the species that had dismissed its author, outlasted 80,000 years of silence and growth and patient, relentless, magnificent construction. We were here. They were still here, and they had been ready for a very, very long time.